couple of weeks ago, I asked, what ruins fantasy antagonists? And the responses have been really interesting. One in particular is not what I saw coming at all. Out of all the genres, fantasy does get a bad shtick for antagonists. I think that's partly because we have a lot of Dark Lords who seem very straightforward, but we'll get into why that might not necessarily be a bad thing. By far, the most common response was something like lack of clear motive, or being evil for the sake of evil. A lack of reason for them to be the antagonist, and really it comes down to this comment here, when their motivations are not logical or when they don't feel like a big enough threat. Now that's kind of a two-parter there. We'll go over the first one first, which is motive. Motive is huge with antagonists. There is an exception to the rule which we'll get onto next, but first, most antagonists need a motive. You need to understand why they are doing what they are doing. If they are just this person doing evil for the sake of doing evil, it's just not interesting to read. They do just become really one-dimensional if you don't give them that motive or interest. And I do think this is more when you are humanizing the antagonist. So if you're making it someone who is meant to have motive, and if they're doing something specifically for a reason, you need to explain that reason. I think one of the reasons why this is so common in fantasy is the fact that when we have a Dark Lord or an evil character, it's very difficult to show their motivation naturally. No one likes the villain at the end of the story going on this rant of, well, this is my secret plan now that you're just captured by this thin piece of rope and your friend that was here earlier has disappeared, but I'm sure he's gone forever. He's definitely not going to come back and free you, and then you'll know my plan. It's like, it's styled Bond villain type monologue. Nobody likes that. In fact, we did get some comments noting that specifically. When they make a big speech before killing the hero, and therefore get stopped before killing the hero. Here's another one saying evil monologue. So then, if you don't have that person being able to tell why they're doing certain things, it can be quite difficult to then show that motive without having a point of view chapter from the villain. Now, that is an option. You can have a point of view chapter from the villain, and I think it's been done very well in some stories. I think it can be quite difficult, but a lot of threat and fear and this sort of impending feeling for the antagonist is through this level of unknown. And if you have chapters in their head, it does sometimes take away some of that threat. So it can be sort of something that needs to be balanced. A possible other option for this is having the protagonist come across reasons why the antagonist has become how he is. If you go through the antagonist's old village and you can see kind of where they started and where they went to, and it does create this mystery of how they ended up where they are, could be a really interesting way of setting up this. They are human, they are a person, and then it also does create this mystery element which can be revealed throughout the story as the protagonist figures it out along the way. So it can be part of the mystery of the plot as well. However, you don't always need very clear motives for your villain. People insisting that villains need a sympathetic backstory or some reasoning for what they are doing. Sauron in Lord of the Rings functions the same way a Lovecraft monster does. The fear comes from the unknown, the unknowable nature of his power and evil. As soon as you start exploring a backstory, the way a show like Rings of Power does, you rob him of his mystique and what makes him threatening as a villain. Yes. What really makes them scary and threatening is the fact that you don't know what their plan is. You don't even know what they look like, or they appear as different forms. Now, this is probably more of a force of nature type villain, which is something or terminology I heard from Jed Hearn. If you haven't checked out his channel, highly recommend. I do edit his videos for him, so I'm a little bit biased, but they are fantastic videos. This is a lot like monsters in horror films as well. You'll see this if you watch a horror film. Is usually scary up until the point where you see the monster. As soon as you see the monster, it's tangible, it's something, and then suddenly it's not that scary. But if you see things moving in the shadow, if you hear a noise, if you see this blur in the back of the camera move past, it plays the creepy music, you see movement, they hear things, that's a lot scarier than just this monster coming down the corridor. Gonna get you. There's just something in the back of our head that says, if you don't know what it is, stay away from it. It's the same reason why kids are afraid of the dark and why we have this instinct to stay out of long grass. It's this survival instinct. It's just, this is a threat, or this is a possible threat. avoid it. And you do lose that by really getting into the antagonist's head. But the question is, what makes this boring one-dimensional villain into someone more interesting, like a Sauron? And that's more to do with the conflict of the story. There's so many minor villains in Lord of the Rings, and you have lots of internal conflict between the party itself, or the fellowship itself, and also internal conflict with the individual characters. It's creating conflict not just against this one antagonist. This becomes more of a force of nature. Then you need to be able to have internal struggles that are a lot more interesting to overcome than just this unknown darkness. So this is the fellowship being created and having these different takes on what to do with the ring, creating conflict. You have Sean Bean deciding to die again and try and take the ring from Frodo. You have all of Frodo's internal struggles throughout the story and how he's constantly moving further and further away from the Shire, but also further and further away from the Frodo that he was in the Shire. And how that shows with the dynamics with Sam. Sam's a really good grounding point in this sort of dynamic, where you see as soon as Frodo starts questioning Sam's loyalties, you can see that he's really not the same Frodo anymore, and he's siding with Gollum of all people. And will he get the ring to Mount Doom and overcome all this adversity and not fall into darkness? I do also want to add that you can make the conflict tied to theme and also morals with the antagonist. So in the case of Lord of the Rings, which we're using as an example in this video, a good example is with the hobbits. They are very much one with nature. So later on in the story, when Merry and Pippin are facing down Saruman as he's trying to cut down the forest, that's very much a thematic conflict between the antagonist and the protagonists at that point in the story. And that also does link in with Sauron and the overarching themes of Lord of the Rings as well. Another super common response was just the villain being defeated far too evilly. Evilly? No, they will definitely be evil easily. The villain being defeated too easily. Constant stupid mistakes, too much arrogance, too much whining. When they are built up to be this big bad wolf, and in the end they're defeated too easily. Turning them into bumbling idiots when it's time for the protagonist to win. This one's pretty straightforward. If the antagonist is built up as this big bad villain and then he's defeated far too easily, it's a very much an anticlimax. It needs to be very difficult for the protagonist to overcome this villain. One really good way of having the protagonist overcome a villain is to make sure that you show how much they have lost in this, even if they have won. You know, have they lost themselves? Are they completely different from the start of the story? A bit like Frodo in Lord of the Rings. Again, this kind of goes into more of the protagonist's arc than the antagonist, in that if the protagonist hasn't changed throughout the story, or if they haven't lost something to win, then it feels very much like a, what was the point of this? We want to see them struggle. Put them through hell. We're really messed up, aren't we, as fantasy readers? Oh boy. One thing that came up a surprising amount was romances with protagonists. We have shoehorned in redemption arcs, which we'll talk about later. Romances with protagonists. The enemies to lovers trope. Forced romance. This one surprised me because it is, or it does seem to be, quite a popular trope with romance and romantasy readers. So, I mean, it was interesting that this came up a couple times. This is very much on the execution, because just by definition, your antagonist and protagonist are head-to-head. They're going against each other in some way or another. They're either fighting for the same thing, or they're fighting for opposite things, but they don't agree. So for them to then fall in love, you need to have a really good reason why they're able to overcome their differences in this sort of situation. One possible solution for this is a redemption arc of a kind. I know redemption arcs actually came up a lot in these comments. Shoehorned in redemption arcs. Not earning the redemption arc. Redemption arcs just let the bad guy be a bad guy. And I would agree with this for the most part. I'm not a huge fan of redemption arcs for sort of the main antagonist. If you saw Sauron and suddenly he was like, you know what, okay, we'll just stay in Mordor. It's fine. It will really take a lot of the punch out of the story. However, for minor villains and minor antagonists, a bit like Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, because you see even from the start that it's less about actually catching the Avatar and more about regaining his honor. And watching him realize that there's more than just regaining his honor in the eyes of his father and more about regaining his honor for himself. And seeing that difference and his arc throughout the story is a great way for him to then kind of shift sides, because it's perfectly foreshadowed. You can see that sort of arc in his character. And in that way, I think Enemies to Lovers could work in that sort of situation. However, I'm not a big romance reader, so I would be interested to hear what you think. If you are, let me know in the comments below. When a dog dies. Yes, 100%. If you kill the animal companion, you suck. That's a no. It's a no. Unacceptable antagonistness. Letting the villain upstage the hero, especially when the villain is unlikable and only is being given so much screen time to garner sympathy for them. Yes, for the most part, especially with sort of heroic fantasy, this can be a big misstep for the sort of tone of the narrative. However, this sort of trope or setup is huge in something like Grimdark, where a lot of the characters are very morally grey, and the whole idea of an antagonist is just a villain in someone's eyes. If you see the story from the antagonist point of view, then they become the protagonist and they are the hero of their story. So if you are trying to make a more classic good versus evil story, and you spend too long in the antagonist's head, you'll start seeing it from their side of the story, and it does kind of make this imbalance because they see themselves as the hero. So it really depends on the type of story that you want to tell. Now, of course, there is an exception to every rule, and there's so many different kinds of antagonists. You can't really create a formula for this is how you do villains. There's so many different ways to make it effective. Just don't kill animal companions. That's the only rule. This is a solid rule. Just don't do it. Just no. Okay? If you enjoyed this, there is a What Ruins Fantasy protagonist video, which you can check out here. And let me know, who are some of your favorite villains in fantasy? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. Outro.